this month. We will take a break at our kind of mid-month meeting, and then we will resume again in the middle of January. We do have a reminder about the upcoming meeting in our slides today, but just so everybody knows, our next Coffee and Conversation will not be until January 15th, 2025. Between then and now, Taylor and I will be doing a bit of work to plan out some upcoming sessions so that we may have a better idea of what is coming for more than 2 weeks at a time. So hopefully that will be helpful to you all. As a reminder, good morning. I am Courtney O'Brien. I am our Interim Operations Director here at the Agency of Education. I work closely with our operations team and with our Secretary's office. And we are now moving forward as your hosts of Coffee and Conversation. We have a couple of guests today who are new to the Coffee and Conversations platform. So a few reminders for everyone. As noted, hopefully on your screens, we have started recording. We will be recording and posting these meetings, so please be respectful and thoughtful about your comments and any chat that gets entered into the chat function, but we do encourage open discussion. I do have some folks from AOE here. I think for sake of time, we will not have introductions this morning, but if folks are willing, please go ahead and enter your name and title and contact information into the chat for our participants to access later. And today we will have a guest speaker with us from New Solutions K-12. This David James will be joining us today to talk a little bit about some of the work that AOE has engaged with his organization around education finance and budget, and some of the upcoming opportunities that you may have to engage in deeper conversations about those two topics. David, this Coffee and Conversations cohort evolved from a technical support need in the early stages of COVID and American Rescue Plan funding. So early on in the COVID early stages of the pandemic, I guess, as we started to receive funds through ESSER and ESSER 2 and ARP, we had a pretty sudden need for some on-the-ground technical support. And so that's what this cohort was really initially made of. We've since evolved. And so what we have now is a very wide representation of members of our field, of our education field, anywhere from administrators to district level positions, teachers and staff positions. We have many facilities folks that join these calls, some safety representatives, school health and wellness and nurses. So really, really great opportunity to talk about some of the work that you all are doing and really in the context of this very broad education field space. So we'll just move forward with the slides quickly. And Taylor, we're doing something fancy now where we're sharing controls of the slides where I have not done before. So just double checking folks can see the agenda for today. Great. Okay. Again, our next meeting will be on January 15th, 2025. Because we do want to both encourage discussion today, but also be efficient with our use of time, I will ask that folks either use chat, raise hand, or wait until the end of the conversation to ask your question. So we won't interrupt David mid-session, but we can go ahead and use that chat to hold your questions if you'd like, or you can raise a hand if there's something quick and relevant that should be addressed right then. Again, my name is Courtney O'Brien. I am our Interim Director of Operations, and helping me out here today is my colleague Taylor Goodwin. She is our Safe and Healthy Schools Coordinator from the AOE Operations team. And with that, I want to acknowledge we still have some folks kind of moving in here, but David, I would like for you to go ahead and take it away.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much for inviting me to join the conversation today. Excited to talk with y'all and share a lot about the work that our team has been partnering with the Vermont Agency of Education on. Really two big topics to talk through today. One, we can share some details about a whole series of supports and sessions that my team and I will be hosting over the course of really the next about 2.5 weeks or so, squarely focused on how to take a more strategic approach to budgeting. And while I won't get into the exact I won't go into all the session details, I will share a lot of information about those sessions, kind of the reasoning, the rationale behind them, and some of the engagement that we did on our part to help inform some of those session topics. And then the second thing I would love to spend some time about, talking through with y'all is around a funding report that we helped put together for the state that really gets into the weeds of how funding works in the state of Vermont and how that is similar or different relative to other states in the country, and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of that. And so just a bit about myself, David James. I'm a managing director here with New Solutions K-12. I lead a lot of our work on staffing and scheduling and academic intervention. I've worked with a number of districts in the state of Vermont, and now excited to partner with folks at the state level. I started my career as a middle school science teacher, eventually ran a school in Massachusetts, but I've been doing this work for nearly a decade at this point. So with all of that said, am I able to switch the slides? Look at that. That's fancy tech. Oh, the slides went down. I switched it and it disappeared. Taylor, is it possible to get
Sorry,
that slide
David,
back
that may have been my fault. I asked Taylor to take it down while you were talking,
all
and the
right.
timing was just impeccable. So David, you had, I think, one slide on in our slide deck about the upcoming sessions. Is that what you'd like to present?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. There we go.
Yes, that way. There we go. Perfect. Yeah, so here's the full list of some of the sessions that our team will be hosting here over the next couple months. We hosted the first one this past Friday. And Courtney and Taylor, I understand that's going to be posted to the agency website, so folks should have access to that. And we'll be recording all of these as we go. Before I walk through some of the topics, just a bit of context. We've been in touch with folks across the state around budgeting and some of the challenges and some of the needs that folks have expressed related to that. And so put together this series, hopefully to address a lot of the needs that we've heard from folks. We 100% understand that budgeting in Vermont happens quite early relative to a lot of other states. And for many districts, you're already pretty deep into the budgeting process. We've had a conversation, in fact, with the district just yesterday that said, hey, we're presenting on Wednesday on this, or we're presenting later this week. So we understand the timing is tight on this. So we positioned a lot of these sessions to be helpful in the moment as you're making some final decisions and lining up your budget presentations and thinking about what's kind of the initial set of information you need for some of these preliminary presentations, but also to pair that with some strategies to consider in both kind of the short term as well as the long term that are just good teaching and learning best practices that you really have to think about carefully, because it takes the right mix of resources to actually implement and to pull off. And so a big focus of these sessions is both called the technical perspective of what are specific, concrete, practical strategies to implement some practices in your district, but also what are the political considerations, recognizing that some of the things that we'll recommend may not be natural or necessarily come easily, and will include some trade-offs and some conversations to go in those directions. And then also just want to make sure that they're, in fact, unique and practical to the Vermont context. That we have a lot of experience working with schools and districts in the state, and know that kind of every school and every district has their own quirks and nuances, and want to be responsive to that. So we've adjusted a lot of our best practices and a lot of what the research says to be reflective of the circumstances that schools and districts are operating in Vermont. And so you can see here a list of the sessions that we'll be running through. The first set are really about staffing precisely. And part of the reason that we focused on this idea of staffing is that for most schools and districts, staffing is going to be what, 70, 80, 90% of your overall budget. And so staffing decisions are one of the best places to look to think, how can we make sure that we're providing our services and education really cost effectively to students. And so we've organized it by different grade levels, recognizing that elementary schools operate differently than middle schools and high schools. So you'll see the first two sessions are squarely focused on the elementary side of the house, first on classroom teachers, and then on specials or unified art teachers like PE, music, art teachers, etc. And a lot of the practices we share there are how to make sure that you're maximizing the impact of the talented staff that you have. And maybe that's using something like part-time staff or shared staff. And we get into details into how to actually pull that off, because I know it's easy to say, oh, use a part-time staff or share staff across schools. But especially as a former school leader and a former teacher, I know that actually can be quite difficult, possible, but quite difficult to pull off. And so we share a lot of strategies and how to make that happen. And then at the secondary level, there, staffing just operates differently because you're not staffing one classroom teacher, you're staffing, say, a math teacher who's teaching across multiple classes, maybe across multiple grades. So there, it's much more thinking about your student enrollment how you can match your staffing in really precise ways to that student enrollment, so you can potentially free up some FTE to teach potentially new enrichments or interventions. That a lot of the practices we'll be sharing will be practices that are cost neutral. They're not going to cost districts more money, but actually can help you make kind of expand the impact of the staff that you have. We'll also touch on some specific strategies for special education teachers. That one will really be cross grade, and as well as reading teachers and other interventionists, such as math specialists or other folks that you have to provide intervention to students. We also have a session that you can see listed there. This is the last one on the staffing side of the house of thinking carefully about how to maximize the impact of instructional coaches. That I think, as is the case in a lot of Vermont schools and districts that we worked with, there's often reason to kind of have multi-hat staffing of someone who's both an instructional coach as well as teaches one or two sections, or someone who's an instructional coach and is involved in school leadership. Or sometimes we've seen an instructional coach who's also the part-time librarian, something along those lines. When we talk through some strategies and how to set folks up well for that. The session there on the 16th that you see is on expanding mental health and behavioral supports cost effectively. That's looking at some of the more creative and actually pretty cutting edge options that we've seen both in Vermont as well as more nationally on strategies schools and districts have used to expand offerings and supports for students beyond just the walls of their classroom. So sometimes that's looking at telehealth options or partnering with some external organizations that can provide service to students, but still in a cost-effective way. And then as you think about the last couple of sessions, we focus less on the staffing side and more on the communication side of things. So those last three sessions that you see listed are really about packaging and positioning and thinking about how to present and talk about your budget with stakeholders more generally. So the first one is squarely focused on best practices for communicating and sharing your budget. We then get into a couple of strategies to build some momentum and engagement and investment in the budgets that you're creating. And then we've heard from a number of folks that the budget presentation, whether that's to the board or to the community, is a very high stakes presentation, a very high stakes conversation. And so we'll share some specific strategies there, as well as a template for what to include or some recommendations as to what to include in that presentation. So folks have access and a kind of comparison point that they can use. And that template, we very much want to make sure is a kind of resource for folks to take and run with. Throughout these sessions, we'll also be sharing a number of tools to help folks take some of the ideas that we share and actually go implement them. So for example, at the elementary classroom session we hosted on Monday, coming out of that session, we shared a tool that helps folks think through how many elementary classrooms they should have and what their class sizes should be based on different enrollment levels. For example, if you have one classroom or two classrooms or three classrooms per grade level, what should that look like with different enrollments to help inform some of your staffing? So a lot of this will be some kind of quantitatively driven tools to help you all make some, I guess you could say, kind of objective calculations and decisions to help inform some of the staffing decisions that you want to make, recognizing that a lot of the staffing stuff is always a mix of what do the numbers say and let's think about who that actual person is and their talents and what they bring to the school, and making sure that they're set up well. In terms of how this list got put together, which I suppose I should have noted at the beginning, we've spoken with a number of folks at the Agency of Education, some folks at the School Business Officer Association, the Superintendent's Association, as well as just a number of district leaders that we've been partnering with over the course of this fall to get input and feedback as to what are the things that are most top of mind for all of you and what are the kind of the topics and sessions that you would be most interested in. And that's really where this list came from. This heard a lot on the staffing side of things and then a lot on the budget communication, which is what we would put here on the back end of things. So that's the quick rundown. I certainly encourage folks to join the sessions that they find most relevant or interesting. Again, they'll be recorded so folks have access to those even if you can't make the session itself. We did intentionally try to make them bite-sized. So most of these you'll see about 30 minutes. There's a couple that are 45 just for some of the budget communication sessions. But really, the intention behind that is to make sure folks can find time during what I'm sure is already a busy day. And if they can't make it, can watch the webinar a little bit later and take in some of those resources for kind of immediate use as you go through the budgeting process. So let me stop there for a second, just on some of these upcoming PD sessions and the topics that we'll be getting to. Happy to answer any questions either about the content or kind of where we're coming from on this that folks might have about those sessions.
So David, I'm just taking a look at the chat. It seems like the one question on everybody's mind is how to access the recordings. And so we've got a couple of solutions to that, but I appreciate everyone's patience. We do have some closed captioning obligations and needs before we can get them published. So there may be a slight delay, and then we'll get those links out to folks.
Great. And there is there's a, through all the sessions, we'll have a Q&A forum that folks will be able to share any questions that they have about some of the topics. That will be a running forum, and that we'll have an opportunity to post any answers, both to the person that asked it, but as well as to the state more generally. So folks, if they have a similar question, they can look at that list and see, oh, someone's already asked it. Here's the answer. We got it. All right, see a hand raised.
Yeah, Paul, go right ahead.
David, I've got a question. It seems to me that in all of this discussion, school size is going to have a huge impact on the kinds of solutions that are proposed. And could you just say a couple of words about how you are approaching school size differences?
Yeah, great question, and something that's very much on our minds as we're putting together some of these sessions. An example is when we hosted that session on elementary classroom teachers on Monday. Sometimes when we talk about that topic, we'll use an example of a school that has 5 classrooms at a grade level, 5 first grade classrooms, 5 second grade classrooms, etc. We know that in many schools in Vermont, that's much larger than the school actually is. Maybe it's 1 classroom, maybe it's 2 classrooms. And so we've adjusted all of our examples and our recommendations to be more, I guess, right sized to the Vermont context, recognizing that y'all just have some smaller schools. And so we're intentionally crafting a lot of our thinking to reflect that reality, because I think a lot of the stuff that we've shared and that we've seen work well in other larger schools are still applicable. You just got to think about it, say, a little bit differently, and note that the scale that you're thinking about is just different than a larger, say, elementary school in this case. So very much aware of that, and trying our hardest to take that into consideration as we put together some of these ideas. Other questions?
We had a question about how to join the session. So folks, if you could take a look at the chat, there are a couple of links available where we have information about this webinar series, and the overview that David has provided is included, so you can understand which meeting you'd like to register for, and Teams meeting links are embedded within that document. So you'll go to you'll go to the specific session that you would like to attend, and you'll register through that. You'll attend through that Teams meeting link. So there's not one link for the entire series. Any other questions for David, folks?
And if not, which is totally fine, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the funding report that we'd also put out by the state. Very much connected to a lot of these topics that I just spoke through and that we'll be hosting sessions on. But I'll pause again just one more time if there's any final questions about some of those upcoming sessions. And if not, Courtney and Taylor, would it be helpful if I got into that at this point, or something different?
Yeah, I think we'll let folks kind of percolate on the webinar series coming up, and certainly everyone, we do encourage you to attend these sessions. But yes, David, I think we can go ahead and move on to the report. I am just going to, I'm navigating to the webpage right now, so I can drop a link to the report right into the chat for folks if you haven't seen this. And right. Taylor's beat me to it. Thank you, Taylor.
All right, well, I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see if I can get this right. Can y'all see that okay?
Looks good on this end.
All right, awesome. So I'll pull up a report. It looks like the link is in the chat as well. So this is a document that we helped put together for the state on Vermont's education funding system. And the reason and the rationale behind this was the understanding that Vermont's funding system is actually quite a bit different than just about every other state in the country. It's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It just is in terms of the setup, and I'll explain some of the details behind that. But we wanted to make sure there's just some clarity in terms of how the system works, recognizing that it is quite complex. And so we tried our hardest to explain it in kind of the most straightforward, though still accurate way possible. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of the system, and how does that compare to some other states? More, I guess, both for a combination of overall understanding for folks in the field of how the funding system works, especially for folks that might be newer to working in education, as well as to help inform future decisions about what the funding system should look like, and how the state and districts more generally can work to can continue to ensure that there's really great opportunities that are well funded across the state. And so I'm going to jump through this in a couple different places, and again, happy to stop and answer questions as part of this. So you can see here a couple major parts. First part is really focused on how Vermont's education funding system works and gets into some of the advantages and disadvantages. And then the second big part of this is focused on how does the Vermont system compare to other states. So what I'm going to do is jump to this first part here of this first question: how is the amount of money provided to each school district determined? Which really gets at the, hey, where is the money coming from if I'm a district leader? And in short, unlike in many other states, essentially districts receive what they request. And that's, of course, subject to voter approval. So we understand school systems will create a budget. They'll look at what their needs are, their students, the staffing, and come up with a number to say, this is what we need to provide education for students in our district. They'll bring that to their community to vote on, and voters will either approve or reject that budget. And then eventually, pending approval, the state then says, all right, yes, for 20 million, here's 20 million, and there's your funding. And that comes from this kind of pool of funding at the state level. That funding is coming from a lot of different places, mostly property taxes, as is the case for many other states, but there's also other sources as well. You can see some of those listed here: sales tax and meals and rooms tax, lottery revenues, etc. That's also pretty common from what we've seen in other states. So I'd say the sources are maybe more similar to what we see in other states versus how that funding is kind of organized and collected, which is a little bit different. I'm going to skip through some of the details here, which I certainly encourage folks to get into and read some of the information there. But I really want to focus more on some of the advantages and disadvantages of the system, because I think ultimately Vermont takes more of a kind of bottom-up type of approach to education funding as opposed to a top-down approach, which is what we see in more states. And by that, I mean, just as I shared, districts and communities will tell the state, this is how much funding we need and we want. And then the state will give them that funding. Vastly oversimplified, but generally speaking, that's how we understand the system to work. Versus in other states, the state will say, hey, district, here's how much money you're getting. Build your budget and allocate your resources around that figure. If you want to raise more, that's up to you, but that's a local decision. And so because of those two really different approaches, we see that local communities in Vermont actually have quite a bit of independence in how much they spend. But strangely enough, kind of less control over how much it will actually cost local taxpayers, because at the end of the day, put simply, everyone pays for every student's education in the state. And so it's really hard for taxpayers to see the impact of their system's decisions on their actual taxes. So for example, a district might say, we want to reduce our budget by 200,000 or $500,000, but still see the community members still might see taxes remain flat or actually increase because neighboring or other districts in the state chose to increase their budgets, and that the cost of that is kind of spread across the state. And so in that sense, it's a trickier system, and to really understand how the impact of decisions at the local level. And so some of the advantages that I would just name that were really highlighted by folks, as well as our own review of a lot of the budget data that we saw. One is that local control aspect. It just gives folks and communities more clarity as to what their actual budget is and where the figures and kind of the variables that are going into it. It does help ensure some degree of equity across districts, because you're pooling resources in what's called this education fund. And while we'd say that's kind of theoretically an advantage of the funding system, because school districts are making some spending decisions independently and don't always choose to spend more, you have some systems that are funding students at a lower rate than system or students in other school systems or districts. And so there's not a kind of base or foundational amount that's expected, which is what we see in other states. And because of that, I think there's just more variation in terms of the per pupil funding that you'd see in Vermont than you might see elsewhere. On the plus side, though, Vermont does have a kind of a weighted component to some of its funding. Students with greater needs get more funding through this weighted system, which I think is a little bit further down here, as part of the overall funding. And so, for example, if a student's living in poverty, or if a student there's a student with disabilities, they would get more funding. And so in that sense, it's good that student need is reflected in the system. And through this system, I think it does allow the state and the school systems to run smaller schools than you might otherwise, because smaller schools can sometimes be expensive to operate, at least relative to the kind of staffing per pupil funding that goes into it. But that those costs are effectively spread across the state in some way because of this education funding pool that's setting up the funding. In terms of some of the disadvantages that we saw, I'd say a few things that stood out there. First and foremost was this kind of the complexity system, or the complexity of the system. There's just a lot of factors influencing tax rates and funding and distribution and weighted student counts and property yield. And so while this report does its best to provide all of that information in kind of the simplified and straightforward way, there's just a lot of complexity to it all that makes it hard for any school system, let alone taxpayer, to fully understand how their taxes are calculated and how local school spending impacts them directly. I'd say another thing that really stood out to us is that there's fewer guardrails just to ensure some consistent budgeting practices across the district, especially relative to some other states. So there's not a minimum reserve required, or a minimum class size, or a base funding amount. And so that certainly allows communities to customize funding to really meet students' needs. It does give folks this fewer comparison points to make sure that what they're spending or what the services that they're providing students is really equitable across different communities. I'd say the last thing I'd highlight is that, coming back to that point around smaller schools, is that, like I shared before, smaller schools typically are more expensive to operate. And so this system does allow for that to happen, but I think it therefore means that you're running more expensive schools because they're smaller than you might otherwise, which we know this is the Vermont context and how kind of the communities and the fact that y'all have just some smaller districts, and that's kind of baked into a lot of Vermont culture and context as we understand it. So again, I'd see that as just a reality, and I think that's one of the big questions for the state going forward is around how do you best want to think about kind of that the often desire that we heard from a lot of folks to maintain a small schools and access to that, but in a way that's perhaps more cost effective going forward. And I think a lot of the sessions that we'll be hosting and the strategies that we'll be sharing very much hit on that point for folks to consider. And so the last couple parts here really highlight how Vermont's education system compares to different states. It gets into the Brigham decision, which some folks on the call might be familiar with, which really is one of the driving factors behind Vermont's current education system. In a nutshell, to really oversimplify things, like I shared before, most states will say state level calculates how much a district should receive. They give that money to the district, and the district makes a decision to say whether that's enough or whether they want to raise more money locally, versus Vermont, which will say the communities and the local school district calculates how much they need. They bring that to the state, and then the state funds it. And so two different approaches to get to the same destination, I guess you could say, but Vermont approach much more unique relative to what we see more nationally. So a bunch more details here just in terms of some of the components of school boards and a couple other variables that make Vermont unique. But let me stop there I'll pull down my screen. And again, happy to answer questions that immediately jump to folks' minds about that report or any of the topics within it.
David, we had a question come through in chat, I think in relation to the webinar series. If there was any, the question was, what about administrative positions? Why is there just a focus on teachers? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the rationale for what was chosen and what was maybe left for a later conversation.
Yeah. Good question. A couple different reasons. One, I think is largely because we see teaching and support staff as the largest budget variable in just about every school district. And so we wanted to make sure that we could provide some strategies that would have the widest impact. And so looking at teaching and support positions like special education, interventionists, instructional coaches, et cetera, volume-wise, this makes sense to start and to focus there. I think a lot of the points that we'll touch on as you think about, especially for the small school context, of how you can have those types of roles, but also make sure that you do it in a cost-effective way, and how that pairs with potential kind of multi-hat roles, like someone who's both an administrator and doing some partial other role, or sharing administrative responsibilities across schools. We'll touch on some of those strategies, though we don't have an explicit session on administration. I think that topic will for sure come up in some of the sessions that we'll be hosting. So I'd say that's kind of the general rationale behind it.
Excellent, thank you. We had another question about the extent of unfunded mandates in Vermont versus other states. And David, I know that this is work that was also slated for a different contractor. So folks may be familiar with our work done through the Listen and Learn Tour and our contracted partners, APA Consulting. Will your company be working at all on unfunded mandates, or is that something that will tag for APA?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say that's more in kind of APA's court. Of less context in terms of, to the question there, of how does Vermont compare on some of those unfunded mandates relative to other states. I wish I knew more about it, but I think that'd be something more for APA side of the house.
Excellent. And Ted, I can also just a little bit of added context to that. I know that APA has started work on this and is really trying hard to define what is considered unfunded mandates versus things that maybe would have existed otherwise. And that distinction was a little bit difficult to come to. So I know that they are continuing down that road, and I will be happy to pass along some feedback to them around, if possible, how would we be able to look at what other states experience in terms of unfunded mandates versus Vermont.
Thank you so much, Courtney. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have a comment, and I'll read this comment is from Amy. I appreciate all the work that's being done regarding delivery model and education funding. However, if there is not an analysis of governance, including at the local level boards and at the state, the intersect of AOE, the state board, and the education quality standards, then we are missing a major component. Why is there no conversation about governance? David, is that something you'd like to address?
Yeah. I'm going to reshare my screen for just a moment to the first part of that question on kind of the local side of things and school boards. We had we did include a section of on school boards here in the report, with the understanding that as you see here, there's just more and often bigger school boards in Vermont than we typically see elsewhere. So a couple stats that when we looked at, we had a spreadsheet that was for every school district or every supervisory union and district, the boards, the number of board members that they had. And so we saw quite a bit of variation when we looked at that. So the number of unified school district boards ranges from 3 to 19 members, an average of 7 members. So some very, very small boards with 3 people, and some very, very large boards up to 19 folks that we saw. Some supervisory unions can have between 2 to 7 school boards. So depending on the number of districts that they have and whether each of those districts or schools have boards, that can really vary, but anywhere between a total of 10 board members in the supervisory union all the way up to 78 board members. So again, just a lot of variation in terms of how many school board members are involved in the overall management of a district and or supervisory union. And then we saw on average supervisory unions have 1 board member for approximately every 75 students when you look at things across the state. And so as a general statement, there's many more boards and board members per student than in Vermont than we see elsewhere. And so I think we noted this to say, hey, as you think about funding and as you think about overall management of schools going forward, it's a question, it's a big part of that question, especially because in a lot of other states, kind of the concept of a supervisory union is a unique thing unto itself. And many school districts will have just one school board, usually of 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe nine folks to supervise 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 students. And so I think the fact that there's many more boards and those boards tend to be much bigger relative to student enrollment is a very unique thing to Vermont. So I'd say at this point, there weren't necessarily decisions or recommendations as to what to do about that, but more to name the fact that this is the Vermont reality and that kind of should be taken into consideration as the state thinks about what how best to support districts and states or districts and supervisory unions manage things going forward. And I think to the second part of your question, the intersect of AOE and state board and education quality standards, I know those are very much on the mind of folks at the Agency of Education, and part of what we'll be doing here over the course of the next couple of weeks and months are putting together a couple additional reports for the state. One on foundation formula and how other states, we'll essentially get into more detail on how other states approach school funding with the idea that provides some additional context and material for the state to consider as it thinks about where it wants to take things going forward, as well as a report specific on special education. And all of that is meant to inform just some of the bigger policy decisions at the state level, which I think kind of gets at some of the points that you're naming in the second part of that question. So still a lot more to come when it comes to that on kind of the governance side of things. But hopefully that hits on a couple of the points that you named.
Thank you, David. And I'll just add to that a bit as well. Again, folks, there's quite a bit of big work happening to try to find the answer to this question, right? I think these are some of our bigger conversations around how education is funded in Vermont. What is the appropriate scale? How do we approach governance, and what is the right balance in doing that? Excuse me. So in addition to the work that David and his company are doing, there's also work being completed by the Commission on the Future of Public Education, which is a legislative body in which AOE has a sitting member, but we do not lead that work. Of course, the State Board of Education is a separate entity that we work in partnership with at the agency level. And all of these players are coming to the table together to really try to understand what is the right solution. Amy, your follow-up to this is, I think, important, which is, speaking specifically about the power of boards and how it can conflict with state governance. That's accurate, right? And intentional. I think that's something that's sometimes hard for us to understand, is that there is an intentional separation between state and local government in that space. And I think that the question that we're all really curious about is, what is the appropriate scale of boards, and what are the roles versus the role of the state in this situation? This is not an answer to Amy's question, but again, another piece of the puzzle to consider. I'll remind folks that the agency rule district quality standards goes into effect on July 1st, 2025, so just this upcoming summer, and that places really specific criteria for proficiency of school boards for the first time, right? So this is a rule that exists there. We don't have this level of detail around what success or proficiency should look like for school boards in quite the same degree of detail as district quality standards will provide. And I can say very confidently that AOE has been working closely with the VSBA, the Vermont School Boards Association, and its members to be really clear and define those quality standards in a way that does not conflict with what has been established for SU responsibilities or state responsibilities. Again, that is not a holistically comprehensive, perfect solution, but it is something that we have available to us in the coming year that we did not have before. So folks can be prepared for that. And certainly if anybody has follow-up questions about DQS, I would be happy to connect with you. Okay. And David, no other questions, but just to kind of, again, add some additional conversation here. David talked a lot about the upcoming reports that he and his team are working on, and how these reports are really designed to ground these policy level conversations in data and information. And so that's something that's very important to the AOE. We are trying to apply that same methodology in a lot of places and to inform really any and all policy conversations and decisions that are coming up. So that's where you'll find, a lot of the work that is being done right now in the 2024 Listen and Learn Tour will ultimately result in a series of reports and summary of information that will help us in the upcoming legislative session. We'll have a series of reporting from David and his company that will help us with the funding and budgeting side. And we'll really continue to use this approach moving forward so that we are prepared with the right level of data to have these conversations and to inform the decision makers who are at those tables. If folks have not seen, we have just recently done a re-release of the State Education Profile Report that was initially released in August. So as a reminder, this was a fairly comprehensive report that showed a lot of information about the education field. I mean, really the landscape of education in VT. So we talk about everything from enrollment to staffing to special education needs to free and reduced lunch eligibility, average daily membership versus what enrollment really means. And so we, after the first report, received quite a bit of good feedback from our partners in field and have made some changes to that. So we've laid out the information differently, we've made corrections where needed, and something that I think has been really useful is we've added a fairly full list of appendices, group of appendices, an appendix that offer a really in-depth look about how these conversations are made. So I think wanting to be really transparent in what numbers were chosen and why and what all of this represents was really important to us and was something that we heard very loud and clear from field. So if you haven't taken a look, I would encourage folks to do so. I have linked it here in the chat, and it is also available on our website's Listen and Learn page. Okay. Folks, any other questions for David, either about the webinar series or the education funding report? Okay, I will signal to you all I'm about to ask a question that is unrelated to these, and I am hoping for some feedback from you all. Excellent. David, thank you so much. We very much appreciate your time today. We are really excited about these webinars. I had the chance to attend the one that happened earlier this week, and it was excellent. I hope that other folks felt the same way. And so I hope that we can see some familiar faces on the upcoming webinar series. David, is there, I think that we talked about this perhaps in our earlier meeting this week, is there a link to the place where folks can reach out to you and your team to ask those specific questions?
There is. I can put it in the chat here.
Great, thank you.
Give me just a second. There we go. Here we are. All right. So I'll put this. Yeah, in the chat. That's a link to the standing Q&A document that we put together specifically for the sessions that we'll be hosting, but certainly use that for other questions that you have coming out of the session today or other things as y'all think of them. Yeah, very much want to be a resource to help y'all get budgets ready for next year and or think through how you can continue to improve budgets for future years. So again, appreciate the opportunity today.
Excellent. David, thank you so much. We are appreciative of your time as well. All right, so folks, before we wrap, I did want to just take a moment here. We've been having some conversation about how to make this meeting series, Coffee and Conversation, specifically more valuable to you all. And I think our approach so far for the 2024-25 school year has been a little bit ad hoc. So we've really kind of moved through these topics that felt very important to our team or that we had a lot of information sitting on the back burner and really needed to get out to you all. But we would like to be able to do this in a way that feels a little bit more proactive, and perhaps we can structure out meetings for more than 2 weeks at a time. So we certainly have some ideas. And what I am preparing to do with our team is set up a new series for calendar year 2025 that would bring us through the end of the school year. I'm really interested in what kinds of topics folks would either have expected to talk about here at Coffee and Conversation or would like to talk about here at Coffee and Conversation, and start to generate some ideas on how we could be more planful in those topics so that you're getting the most bang for your buck. Any burning thoughts today, folks? Anything you have thought about in the past or really thought, wow, this would be a really great copy and conversation topic? Nothing? Are we still feeling like CNC is useful? Thank you, Paul. Go right ahead.
Sure. Even though I'm sort of exiting, I still feel like, yeah, absolutely. Even for somebody who's only doing part-time work these days, it's hugely useful information providing context. Something that does occur to me is a couple of pieces of David's presentation felt to me like, boy, maybe we could have a little bit more extended conversation. For instance, use of instructional coaches or use of social workers in schools. What's best practice? What are people doing? And how can we be more, I don't know, efficient, more thoughtful about how those folks get used? It feels like the landscape since COVID has changed enough that having a kind of a statewide conversation at the level of what's the best use of those staff members might be really helpful beyond the discussion that happens in those half-hour sessions that David's running.
Sure. That's a great suggestion, Paul. And I think something that we could certainly work with David and his team on is what are those kind of outstanding parts of the conversation that don't fit into the half-hour increments, and how could we incorporate them into later sessions? I'll be the first to say it's difficult to have those kinds of conversations here in copying conversations because my team are not the experts in that work, right? So we would certainly want to do that in a time when we could have someone like David or someone from his team join us. But I think that is a really great suggestion is consider what is left over from those sessions and how could we continue those conversations moving forward. Thank you. And there's a couple comments coming in. Thank you folks for responding. I am happy to hear that this is still helpful to you all. I'm hearing that, just generally it's still a good platform, feels like a good way to get updates from the AOE, which can sometimes get lost in emails or the website. So if folks feel like that would be useful, we can kind of take maybe either time during each meeting, or I can add a slide to each meeting and maybe do a recap of recent announcements so that folks have that at one time. And okay, great. And a nice suggestion in here on maybe using this as an opportunity to provide updates during the legislative session. I think that is absolutely important and could be something we could build in somewhat regularly, especially as session begins in January. All right, folks. Well, I do appreciate Ted's suggestion to think on it a little bit, sleep on it, December on it, if you will. And then I am very open to any suggestions from folks about what we might want to incorporate into the next meeting series here. So keep your eyes open for changes. We will try really, really hard not to update any of the Teams link information because I know that is sometimes confusing when we change that around. But we are looking for a mechanism that makes it a little bit easier for us to plan these meetings out for a longer term. Okay. All right, everyone. I will, Amy, I am seeing your comment here, and I think that's important as well. We'll take a look at how we can do this in a way that is more partnered with other folks in the education field. So, okay. Thank you, everybody. I very much appreciate your time. We'll give back about 10 minutes. Sorry, it's not more, but I think we had a great conversation today and found David's presentations to be very useful. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Taylor, and we will either be able to answer or connect you to the folks who can. Reminder, we will not meet again until January 15th, so we have a couple of weeks in between. I hope that everybody has an amazing and safe break. Please, again, reach out with suggestions on topics, and we will see you soon. Thank you so much, everyone.